American West is changing fast, and one of the biggest forces shaping that change is development. We're talking about sprawl, those 35-acre subdivisions, ranchettes you see spreading across the landscape. They can mean paradise for some, and the unraveling of communities, wildlife habitat, and productive landscapes for others. Today, we're talking about what's driving that growth, what it means for landowners and rural economies, and what kind of solutions might help us strike a balance between private property rights, conservation, and community needs. On the show today, our CEO, Leslie Allison, sits down with Ken Mirr, founder of Mirr Ranch Group and longtime land broker, who has worked at the intersection of ranching, conservation, and real estate for decades. I'm Zach Altman, and this is On Land.
Well, good morning, Ken. It is just great to have you back on the On Land podcast and just to see you. It's a great opportunity to be able to visit and catch up.
Glad to be here.
So today we are going to be talking about a pretty tough subject in the West, and that is sprawl. And what people mean when they use the term sprawl is usually this rapid, unrestricted, low-density housing development. Think large lot subdivisions or ranchettes, and it's something that we see virtually everywhere in the West. And what is to some people a piece of paradise is to others the ruin of the West. Large lots, for example, Colorado's 35-acre subdivisions offer people privacy and open space and wildlife watching and the opportunity to live a rural lifestyle. And at the same time, they also spread the human footprint and impact much farther across the landscape than more dense urban development patterns. So we're going to talk about all that and maybe what are some of the possible solutions. But first, I'd like to introduce our guest, Ken Mirr. Ken is one of the West's top producers and has brokered the purchase and sale of thousands of acres of land in the Western United States and South America. He began his career as a public lands attorney who assisted ranchers, conservation groups, natural resource companies, ski areas, telecommunications companies, and others in handling specialized land transactions with state and federal land agencies throughout the Rocky Mountain region. And then in 2005, he founded the Mirr Ranch Group, which is a real estate ranch brokerage specializing in legacy and sporting properties with conservation values. Over his career, Ken has brokered open space and land conservation transactions and consulted on conservation easements, exchanges, grazing issues, and special use permits. Ken serves on the board of the Colorado Cattlemen's Agricultural Land Trust and is a past board member of the Western Landowners Alliance. Raised in a steel town on the shores of Lake Michigan, Ken developed a passion for conservation and has made it his life's work in the Rockies. So Ken, again, thank you for joining us for a provocative and complex subject, but one of central importance to the future of the West. But before we dive fully in, can you share why conservation is important to you and how it intersects with your work as a ranch broker?
Sure. Well, and thank you, Leslie. It's good to see you and good to be chatting. It was funny, you threw in the fact that I grew up in Northwest Indiana and grew up near these still towns, but you still had Lake Michigan, this beautiful lake and sandy beaches. And I remember as a kid, we even had this area where they were starting to develop in these dunes, these beautiful, pristine dunes. And there was a Save the Dunes campaign in and around that whole area of Northwest Indiana. And eventually it became a national park, which was fascinating. And I was kind of young at the time. I thought, oh, that's neat how you can do that. You can actually have an impact and imprint on some of these things that we used to play, toboggan in the winter and explore. And then when I moved to Colorado, and my first job out of law school was actually working with a company that was a land developer. And I helped people obtain entitlements so they could build homes or commercial properties in, areas around Colorado, Texas, and Georgia. So I had a little experience in that. And, you could see wise development and wise use. But in Colorado, I used to see sometimes these 35-acre subdivisions built in the middle of nowhere. And you realize, wow, you have to extend all these utilities to get to them. But you still have the right to do that, of course, by state law. And I also remember reading early the Ranching West of the 100th Principal Meridian with Rick Knight and some of those guys that all participated, and reading about the ecology of ranching. And I realized that if ranches disappear, ergo wildlife habitat and all these other impacts, and ergo even the management of some of the public lands, because the ranchers have an impact on managing these things. So I just saw the interconnection of all these things, and that really got me interested in saying we need to figure out how to protect these things and make people understand there's a reason for this, not just in Colorado, for instance, we have monetary reasons and justifications. We have federal tax laws to support land conservation, but there's a lot of real justifications that you need to look at. Even if you don't do an easement, just keeping it as a ranch. And I started thinking about cows versus condos in my brain as you drive the interstate, even to go skiing, things like that.
That's a great segue into this first question as we start thinking about sprawl is, what's causing it in the first place? So what causes those ranches to convert from cows to houses, for example? Why are they being subdivided and developed? In the last agricultural census from 2017 to 2022, Colorado saw 1.5 million acres convert out of agriculture, primarily to development. And you see that every state has some similar statistic. And you certainly, as you say, you don't need studies to see it. You can see it happening everywhere. I take pictures of it as I fly around the West, visiting different towns. You can see it out the airplanes. You can see the building cranes, a lot of development happening. So from your experience as a broker and working on these issues for so long, what is it that causes a landowner to decide it's time to sell? And then conversely, what's driving the demand on the buyer side? Why are we seeing this?
There was a book called The Atlas of the New West that was published, I think, by the University of Colorado. And I think it's a little older now. It's probably come out 20 years ago. But all of it is the same. And I think part of it, I always say there's a mystique of living in the West. Here I am, a Midwesterner that now lives in the West. And the whole philosophy of go West and the idea of land ownership is such a integral part of foundation, what we live as a country. It's very different. I was with somebody recently and having dinner from Uruguay. We were talking about just the idea of land ownership in and of itself is such an important motivator for people. And you find it's just, there's the beauty, there's a mistake, there's this existential kind of growing up and watching The Lone Ranger and things like that get people somewhat leaning towards there. From the buyer side, there's a lot. It's the beauty, it's being near wildlife and a different form of wildlife, say, and the mountains and fresh water and all those things. And I think it's just always been there. And in my work on the ranch, we tend to work on larger scale deals. So we're not always looking really at subdivision, or the justifications aren't really to build subdivisions and things like that. They're more about, I'd love to own that gem, that rare stone or that rare painting or something like that. And they truly do typically love embracing what it means to care and be a steward, where I think everybody has their own, wants to own a piece of paradise. And that should be a right for people to have that opportunity, I guess, too, right? I mean, that's part of living here. You think about the San Luis Basin, for instance, in Colorado, and all those 35 acres, tracts that were sold. And there's thousands of acres of those, and there's nothing on them. And a lot of people bought into some of those things. This is the far end of the scale where subdivision took off, or the idea of breaking a flat piece of ground into all these squares, so to speak, or rectangles. And people didn't realize, oh, I have to pay property taxes now. And so they started losing those to the developers because they couldn't even pay the property taxes because they never built on them. So there's that far end of the spectrum where they were just bad from the get-go. Just taking a piece of just really raw, fundamentally nothing on it, and trying to make some money on it. And that was a real speculating portion. And then there's the others that are much nicer, but it's a little too easy sometimes in some of these counties, because counties have an impact. Some counties are very pro-growth, and they want that tax revenue. They want that. And so they'll allow some of these things to happen. And that creates a bit of a blight occasionally on some of these rural areas where the county is really, there's very few places in the West. I don't want to say like Oregon. Oregon has a statewide land use planning. We can talk about that. But it becomes easier for people who to buy property and develop it. In the West, it's quite easy. And then they set the price. And that attracts people who say, I can't afford Aspen Vale, Jackson Hole, or towns with lots of amenities. We're going to live out here. It's going to be cheaper, but I can afford it.
Yeah. So a question about that. I was on a planning commission in Archuleta County in Colorado for a period of time. And I've also done a lot around property tax structures. And, counties, and you'll hear this a lot, is that we need growth, we need development. It's good for the economy. It's good for the tax base. I think that's a widespread perception, but I think the studies contradict that quite a bit. So, one of the things from the property tax base standpoint is, and you mentioned this earlier, if you do development far out from the urban service core, then you're talking about sending school buses and ambulances and all the different services of the county, water, way far out of town and to low population areas. So there's not a great return on that investment. In fact, the amount that they can collect on property tax often doesn't equal the cost of the services to the community. And so in a sense, from the tax standpoint, that rural sprawl can impoverish counties. And I saw that happen in our county. Your road maintenance becomes less because you have to spread the same out over a much larger base, and there's not the tax revenue to support that. And the other thing that I was just talking about this with a landowner up in Montana, watching a town that was once vibrant become more or less a ghost town. And it's been happening because you have second homeowners that'll come in and buy large lots like that. That raises the price of land and homes. That means that your year-round sort of families, working families, can't afford to be there. Now you don't have kids in the schools. You have people who are there for just a few months out of the year, which isn't enough to sustain the local businesses. So the local businesses begin to fold, and you kind of create a ghost town. So even though you might have a bump on the construction of homes in a subdivision, after that, the economic impact on the community may not be positive. And I think it varies by circumstance by different counties, but I think there's a little bit of a myth around growth is always good from the economic standpoint. What's your observation on that?
Yeah. You scratch your head and you wonder why. And I agree with you from a land use and from an economic standpoint. I don't know if it's at some point a rub, the folks of saying, hey, it's your land, you get to do with what you want, the real private property interest components, because it doesn't make sense. And I think you have a lot of these areas where you have landowners that have a significant land ownership, especially old ranchers, fifth generation, fourth generation ranching families. And they also don't want someone to tell them that now you can't do 35 acres, you got to do 160 acres or some other size that starts impacting their expectation, I guess, from owning land. And at what point is a regulation a taking? And I think we're seeing that a significant pushback right now in the United States on that whole idea of regulations are bad. And therefore, we need to remove these regulations because that's essentially un-American sometimes. Ralph Nader sometimes went overboard back in the day of having too much regulation in the United States, certain things. And California is probably a good example of how hard it is to build and things like that. But there is some sense that regulation is good in these communities because it protects them from some of these issues. And so I think just everything's kind of hitting each other in the head right now. The pro-development side of it versus the idea that you can't pay for this. I mean, somebody's going to pay for that development. This especially was revealed during the whole COVID-inspired purchases in the West. And you saw the markets just go way high. People thought, well, if this is the end, or if I can't send my kids to school now, I'm going to go somewhere out west where we have a little more freedom to move and live in a place where I want. And if I don't have to work downtown Chicago, New York, or wherever, I'll live out here. But the rates just shot up. Everybody's moving. And you thought, how are these communities going to withstand this impact? How are the schools? Now we went the other side. Now we have too many kids in the school. We have too many people using the water. And it was a short-term deal because now we're seeing the flip side. That demand is gone. Now people are trying to sell. So I do think that part of it is maintaining private property rights. And how do you balance that with sound economic and ecological management? And it does get to this land use issue because most of the land issues are local and those decisions are made locally. And then you have state laws like in Colorado, 35 acre, which is a state law. You have each of those jurisdictional issues kind of hitting each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And then it's confounded as well by the large percentage of absentee landowners who are not involved locally in that decision making, but are obviously having impacts on it and affected by it. So there's that layer too. And it's been my observation that the regulatory approach really is that double-edged sword, and it can have some really negative effects. For example, it can take incentive opportunities off the table. If you regulate land use to a certain level, it lessens opportunities for landowners to be able to generate some return from keeping land whole, like through an easement, things like that. It can make it difficult, of course, to develop the property for the maximum profit, should that be what they want to do. A lot of times landowners, land is their biggest financial asset. It's their equivalent of their retirement fund, and the ability to sell off a piece of it may be what keeps the rest of the land whole, or it may be what allows their children to come home and be part of the operation. So the regulatory approach has some real negative sides for landowners, in addition to this idea that it's kind of a violation of private property rights. And then what I see on the other hand is that unrestricted growth has also negative impacts on landowners and their property values. You could quickly be surrounded on your property by development that isn't going to support your property values or your agricultural operation or anything else. It may not support the community that you and your family depend on. And so what I've been hearing is, while many landowners have been opposed to regulatory approaches, there's been a sort of a soft shift in that in response to this COVID influx that you're talking about, saying, geez, our community as we know it is disappearing before our eyes. Something needs to be done. Maybe we should rethink some kind of regulatory approach. And at the same time, optimally, we would go with an incentive-based approach, but most counties don't have the kind of money it would take to use incentivized approaches to keep the land intact. There's some money for easements in some cases, but in a lot of cases, there's just not that kind of resource available. So I do think it's about finding that balance. Easements, and I want to maybe segue a little bit here into easements too, because you've had a long history of involvement with conservation easements. That's been one of the primary tools, incentivized tools, that has been available to landowners to address some of this challenge. And yet easements right now are also under fire, right? There's a lot of controversy around easements that seems to be growing at the moment. Could you give us just a little primer for folks about what a conservation easement actually is? Because there's some misunderstanding about what it is and how that tool works in this. And then maybe areas where the tool needs to be augmented. Does conservation easement solve everything? No. Where are some of the gaps?
Sure. Well, the one thing I've always liked about easements was the idea that it's voluntary, and it's essentially a deed restriction. It imposes a long-term and perpetual. It's the traditional model of placing a restriction on your property, and it's a deed restriction essentially where a landowner says, I will give up these certain rights, and those are negotiable, what those rights are, but they're usually centered around density on a piece of property. Let's say you look at a 35-acre place like in Colorado, for instance, and you had 350 acres, you could build 10 home sites. Well, you can give up rights, and those rights would say, well, I give up everything but a 35-acre site for my homestead. And by doing that, there's federal incentives for a tax deduction, but you're giving that to a local land trust, essentially, who holds that easement and enforces that easement against you and against future landowners. But there are incentives, financial incentives for doing that. There's federal tax regulations as a charitable deduction. And then it helps stave off some estate issues. If you're passing it down to heirs, it reduces the basis as the property is transferred to the next generation. And it can help also stabilize the property taxes. So as we get into maybe the discussion about property taxes, it can at least maintain those property taxes as agricultural status. And that's something to talk about in the West because it's slightly different than other places east of the Mississippi. There's incentives there with if you're running cattle, producing on your property, hay or other things. And then finally, in places like Colorado, there's a few states, there's a tax credit within the state that has really been very popular in a place like Colorado, where that tax credit can be sold. So the landowner can sell that tax credit to somebody who needs that. And they could sell it at 85 cents on the dollar or whatever that market value may be and get paid cash for that tax credit. So they have been effective. They've been around for a long time. And, every state in the union has some protocol for dealing with these essentially. But it's been helpful because it's put people that have had properties and been able to stave off the tax collector, especially in transfers and estate issues. But you're right, things have changed. And in Colorado, that program has become so popular, especially the state credit, that you can't even start using credits today until, 3 or 4 years now. And that tax credit system is going to sunset at some point here too, within 10 years. So it's an evolving, like everything else, you get the pitfalls with the idea of going past these. It's really been beneficial. I've been on the Colorado Cattlemen's Agricultural Land Trust for a number of years, and they have about 800,000 acres of land under easement, and then Colorado Open Lands has another 700,000 plus. So Montana land reliance is very big. One thing we didn't talk about a little bit is geography and the whole public land component in the West. And now you have those layers of ownership of federal forests, BLM, state, national parks, Indian reservations, and things like that. And now you have another layer, really, of lands that are conserved. And so you look at now, what are those restrictions throughout the West? And I feel like these easements are a lot of times keystone type properties, but they've spread to other things. It's not hard to have the necessary requisite of conservation values to protect your ranch either.
Hey everyone, Lane Justice here. I'm the Idaho Resources Coordinator at the Western Landowners Alliance. And if you like WLA, I promise you'll love this event, Idaho. On Land is produced with support from the Trailing of the Sheep Festival, taking place October 8th through 12th in Ketchum. 5 days of food, music, storytelling, and yes, 1,500 sheep trailing right through the center of town. I'll be there, so come chat with me about why I love working lands and sheep so much. Come celebrate the history and cultures of sheep herding in Idaho and the West at the Trailing of the Sheep Festival. Learn more at trailingofthesheep.org.
You bring up a really important point, because I think that a lot of people look at the public lands in the West and state lands and all that and say, there's plenty of land that's in open space. Why would we restrict development on this increasingly small private land base? Obviously, communities need to grow. Obviously, we need economic activity. We're going to talk about affordable housing here soon. So why would you allow further growth restriction on the private land base? And one of the things that we know at the Western Landowners Alliance is that the public lands are wonderful and great, and our national parks are a great treasure. But the private land base is really where you have your most fertile soils, the majority of your wildlife, the ability to do agricultural production and have local food security. There are a lot of very important values about private lands. And often the private lands really are in those sort of valley bottoms and things like that, whereas the public lands, there's a fire and ice, right? The high peaks, the broad deserts like canyon lands. Those are beautiful places. They're beautiful to go visit and recreate. They're great scenery. But those really important lands for agriculture, for wildlife, that's in the private land base. And so that's a much smaller section in many places that is important to conserve as well. And I think people just don't recognize that not all land is equal. And we have to also think about how do we conserve those most productive parts of the landscape as well. And there is a tension in that. In a moment, we'll talk about the housing crisis in the country and how this interfaces with that. But I'd like to circle back for a moment to why easements are being challenged right now, because like you said, there's more demand from the landowner side than can be met. There's an overwhelming demand for conservation easements in the landowner community. And yet we have some people saying these are a violation of property rights, or they're an interference in the ability of local governments to manage growth. There's people who have inherited an easement that they did not negotiate, have contested those easements, and so they're becoming somewhat controversial in that sense. Talk about the controversy here.
Part of it started with the abuse of the process, I think, because within any of these tax motivations, and if there's some kind of voluntary or whatever that reward is, it doesn't involve appraisals. And nationwide, they were abusing that system. So part of that controversy really started, I thought, with the overvaluation and impact of easements. And so people were just assessing these things at a much higher rate. They were just overappraising the value of these lands and therefore overappraising the diminution of value, which then meant that somebody, and maybe it was in the federal tax system, was losing out on values because of us just simply over assessment of values. And we had that in Colorado, especially with the tax credit, because the Department of Revenue wasn't really overlooking the values itself. Everybody thought, oh, we'll just have good appraisals and things like that. So a lot of the controversy, in my feeling, started with that. And then, some started looking at it, well, why did we create this system in the first place? And what is that impact? In my perspective, if a landowner wants to, give somebody, a neighbor, an easement across their property, they have a right to, right? They have a right to negotiate that. If they want to allow a power line to go through or to service their property, they have a right to negotiate an easement. To me, as I look at it from a legal structure, it's an easement. You have a right to do what you want to with your property. And I sometimes feel that the way that people look at it is like, if you limit the ability of somebody to do an easement, then you're taking another private property right away from them because it's an easement. You get to do with your property as you see fit. And then you have these various communities saying, well, we had it zoned for this, or we wanted to use it as this, or we saw it as this vehicle here. And now you've changed it. And now, as we expand our community, we have to leapfrog over that easement to get to another place that we may want to develop. And I can see how that pathway or those goals of local planning can be sidestepped because of individuals' decision to do it. And I think that's what you're seeing is just more and more easements are occurring. They're occurring now, not just like you said in the riparian corridors with the great soils and the ecological habitat. Now they're happening kind of right next to communities and things like that. So it is becoming a somewhat of a private land use decision that's impacting public land use decisions. I think there's this tension there because of that.
And there's also the tension with the affordable housing question. And that really surfaced recently in that bid by some members of Congress to sell off public lands to support development of affordable housing across the West. And that was proved to be wildly unpopular with Americans and was retracted at the end of the day. But the fact that there is an affordable housing crisis remains out there. And the question of how, easements and just more broadly land conservation interfaces with that is very much on the table. And I think to really understand how to go forward with that, you have to start with understanding, are the roots of the affordable housing crisis the lack of available land to build on, or are there other roots? And I'm curious how you're seeing that in the West.
I hate using just Colorado, but I see this every day. You open up the paper. Boulder County had a very active open space conservation program. They bought up all this open space, and it just drove up the property values. It's the whole of the donut, and the exterior part of the donut is national parks and forests and all of this. So there's a lack of private land to be developed, or the private land that is available is so expensive that it makes it very difficult for affordable housing to work. And you get these areas like Boulder, or there you go to Aspen, Pitkin County, they bought up so much open space that now it's a supply-demand issue from that standpoint. So it does make it very difficult. And you look at the ski areas and resorts in all these different states, sometimes the state or the county never really set aside or required like a ski area to supply that housing for this vehicle that they created. And some of it's on public land too, right? These ski areas. And they're utilizing all these other resources, but they're not required to provide the housing for some of these people. And I think that's a little crazy too, because you're getting a benefit over here, but you're not supporting that benefit by providing some of that. And some of the states do require that now. And again, it runs counter to some of the freedoms and maybe becomes again another regulation. But I've always been one as that if you created the problem, you need to help solve it too. And when it comes to the federal side, I was involved in federal land exchanges for a long time of my life. And sure, there are probably areas of public lands that could serve for that purpose, right? And if that's the case, there's planning associated with ownership of federal lands, right? BLM has their resource planning. Forest Service has their planning. If we want to start instituting some type of planning mechanism around housing that might make some sense, that's great. But I felt that they were using that argument primarily to open up public lands for acquisition. And it really came out of states like Utah that are pretty much anti-federal government land ownership. And we understand why, right? 70% of the state is owned by the federal government. So I understand where those feelings and that sentiment comes from. You get some of these states that have an overwhelming basis of federal land in it. They don't like that. They want more private ownership. So there has to be a balance. But part of that decision, I think it served a nice purpose to say it was principally for that. But I just question whether or not that was the real reason behind it.
Yeah, and we came out in opposition to that as well. Our members strongly opposed the proposal, particularly the mandated disposal of certain amounts of federal land. And there's just places where it didn't really actually make sense that liquidating certain parcels would actually help with the affordable housing crisis. They're too far out of town. There was all kinds of issues that would not really make a lot of sense there. I look again across the West, and I think that the percentage of second homes in a lot of counties in the West is very high. In many cases, it's by far the majority of homes in a county. So I think there's a question of how second homes are impacting the affordable housing and what might be done around that. And then, of course, we know that, the short-term rentals are having impacts on housing in a very major way. We know that the cost of construction is having an impact. When I was looking for property myself recently, I really didn't have any problem finding pieces of land. I'm not in Jackson Hole or Aspen, but out here where I am near Santa Fe, I didn't have a problem finding reasonable parcels of land. But the cost of construction is huge, and the delays and the supply chain challenges right now are a major factor in that. The permitting, all the things that go into the cost of these homes is another factor that people have looked at. So the picture is bigger, I think, than just, how much land is available to develop on. And as I said, in certain places, there's no question that there is a lack of affordable land. But in a lot of the West, that's not the primary driving issue for affordable housing.
I think counties should look at, is there a different tax base, a revenue base for second homeowners versus primary? Because you're right, the schools they're empty or they're too full because of COVID. But at the same time, are they paying their fair share for what's happening in those values? And, but you can go on the flip side. I've been working up in Pickens County, and I see, wow, those prices drive up the affordability even further because of those requirements. They create these limitations through growth through other ways and say, well, we can only build 25,000 square feet in this particular area on an annual basis. And then you start saying, wow, at what point do they get involved so heavily, over-regulating a little bit? And I get it. I mean, it's being bought up and things, but there's no simple answer. But I always thought that there's some virtue in good planning and sound planning. And I see the Land Use Institute and those things that are out there from a private standpoint. I go, those are some creative people with great ideas. How can we help support better just land use planning in communities? And that should involve, of course, public lands as part of that component. And it's always a question, why can't we all get along?
I've seen some very creative things coming forward. I was personally a fan of the idea of cluster development incentives when I was on the Planning Commission. And for listeners who haven't spent a lot of time in the county courthouse or the town planning commission meetings, there are creative ways that say to a landowner, hey, you can develop even maybe more density if you'll cluster it into a smaller area. So maybe if you have a large, 350 acre ranch and you cluster those 10 homes into a corner of it. So on 5-acre lots instead of 35s, maybe we'll throw in a couple of extra density allowances there. So maybe you can develop 12 homes, and then you leave the rest of that land in open space for the wildlife, for the water, all the other resource values. And that's attractive for the homeowners as well. They have less land they have to care for, but they get the benefit of the open space and so forth. And that can save the developer costs too, in terms of laying the infrastructure for those developments. So those are the types of win-win solutions, sort of village models of development. You want to create a development system where you don't have to drive an hour to get the gallon of milk, but you're still conserving the open space. And that village model can also help with affordable housing in rural areas. So there's some real blended kinds of planning ideas that have been out there for quite a long time. And I think a lot of that really is about community engagement and envisioning the communities that we want to live in. I think a big challenge that we do see in the West is people moving in from outside the community, and it's just about my place, my piece of land. I can do with it what I want, not being aware of the impacts that has on their neighbors and on the local school systems and everything else, the local tax base. Maybe there's ways we can encourage landowners to be more proactively involved with their communities, to understand that, and also developers, inviting developers to be more a part of the solution building in these spaces. But I think it's going to come down to finding those more creative ideas and then figuring out ways we can also incentivize on a voluntary basis, doing more to keep the best places intact so that we still can enjoy our wildlife in the West, so that we still can have agricultural economies and communities and local food security. Those things are really important. And so there has to be that right balance. And that does require good community engagement and a willingness from all the different sides to have that conversation and then move beyond just what's in it for me. What's in it for me as a developer? What's in it for me as a landowner? What's in it for me as the county tax assessor? There's a bigger picture.
Well, the thing you mentioned a lot was community. And I think just some people think they can live out in the sticks and do it. But I always sense that most people grew up in communities and they still want communities and they want to be part of that. So things like you're saying with the clusters type of development, it still creates a sense of community, but you then have all this open space. And those certainly are alternatives. We saw for a while this kind of shared ranch or amenity ranch. But I found a lot of those shared ranch projects fail miserably, especially if they're not close to some type of real amenity like a town. If they're built in the middle of nowhere, they just don't have that same luster. So I've seen different voluntary ways of doing it, and they failed. I've lived in lots of different communities, some with cul-de-sacs, some with this, some with that. And I find there's just a psychological impact of how you plan a community. Just like you would anything in the West. You think about the demands of the water, and now all the fires and the drought, and there's a lot to be taken into consideration here. This year was a tough year, even up in our mountains here with the drought. I go up on these irrigated bottomlands, and there's a lot of yellow. There's not a lot of green. And you just start looking at that, and you go, then how does drought impact any of these decisions going forward? So those environmental impacts, those ecological changes, also have to be taken into consideration.
Yeah, absolutely. I wondered about that with the whole question of selling off public lands, because a lot of the proposed areas are in some of the areas where we have the greatest water shortages. And we don't have the water capacity to hold certain levels of development. And that is going to be a challenge. The other thing that I've noted, and I will get close to winding up here, but rural communities have had forever to rely on one another, right? To get through those fires, to get through those floods, people pull together. They fight fires on each other's lands, figure out how to do it. And yeah, we fight rural communities too. It's not all perfect harmony, but no individual is going to be able to make it alone. And so it does take a community to get through these difficult times and to raise children. And I think, again, one of the changes that we're seeing is that people coming in from elsewhere are really looking to sort of get away from it all, have their own sort of private place, not really have to interface with neighbors. The internet, social media gives people their social circles, right there through their computer. They don't have to interface with those neighbors. I don't mean to be so much picking on absentee owners. Many of them are just some of the best land stewards out there and are helping. And yet, because they don't vote and they don't tend to participate in civic boards and things like that, they tend not to be as integrated into the communities. And that creates some real fracture lines and some real challenges when it comes to community self-reliance and resilience. And I think I say it because I think it's something that it would be great for people to pay attention to as landowners, as new homeowners into the area. Be aware of that, see how you can build and participate in your local community, because that is really important, especially right now, especially with the changes we're seeing both on the landscape and financially in the country. We're going to need more of that self-reliance and resilience in the communities.
Yeah, I think about just, especially as the ranchers I deal with, the whole idea of the branding and bringing the community together. That's such a part of that community. Or when something breaks down or you're digging a ditch, your community is always there to kind of support you. And yeah, you hate to always drive by a ranch or even a house and say, oh, that's that guy that's really never here and we don't know much about. And even as a kid driving by, there was hardly ever any second homes where I was, but you kind of knew where some of those things were, right? And you just thought, why do you have that here if you're not here? You were just scratching your head as a kid.
Yeah.
We didn't realize that somebody else would have wanted to live in our private Shangri-La, so to speak. And that's what happens. You love something to death, but you're not there all the time because you can pay for it, right? So you just say, I love it just as much as you, and I'd love to participate, but I just can't be here year round. And that's kind of how they feel. And I've always thought it was incumbent on us, even as we broker deals with ranchers, just to make sure they understand what their commitment is here and what they're supposed to do. I was working on a project outside of Sun Valley, and somebody came down to look at 1,000 acres. I thought, I can't imagine irrigating all of this. And it's like, well, there's a process. You can hire people, and this is how you manage it. But they just couldn't get their hands around any of that, right? It was like, a 10-acre spot is huge, or 2 acres is a lot. They're just thinking of gardening in their backyard or something and don't understand how that fits in the whole equation of the whole valley, that there's production here that services a greater need than just you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is really about expanding our awareness beyond our own property boundaries, right? To understand how we fit into that larger community and either impact it in a positive way or in a negative way. And then conversely, it is, I think, also incumbent on folks that live in towns and on our local government leadership to understand the enormous value that the private landowners are contributing to the community. That beautiful scenic place is that way because somebody took the effort to invest in it and hold it open and keep it beautiful and make sure that there's wildlife out there. And so it really is a two-way relationship between landowners and the community, the full-time residents and those or not full-time residents. So it's probably as much as anything a process issue, right? Is how do we come together? How do we look at these questions together in a more civil way and come up with the solutions? I've come to firmly believe in the process of collaboration when you bring people to the table with good intention, even with diverse perspectives and interests. You can often come up with some very surprising and creative solutions to things you thought you may never be able to solve. And I think that's going to have to be where we go in a lot of our Western communities.
I think part of it, when we talk about conservation easements too, I read Billionaire Wilderness some time ago and things like that. And sometimes I feel like, am I part of the problem too, where we focus so much on the land protection, but we forget about the services and the community? That was a big focus of that particular book, where people were doing really well on protecting the land, but nobody was investing in those services and support of the community. And I think that needs to be redirected. They all try to blend in, but like, hey, maybe there's other incentives here we can do, right? To work on the social service side of it, so that the people who actually cut your grass or work in your home or work at the grocery store or work on your car when you're not there, they're benefiting and they're integrated in the community, so to speak.
Absolutely. Well, there's so much to cover, Ken. I think we're kind of getting near the end here of our session today. Any closing thoughts or things? You've been in this for a long time. You broker deals all the time with land. What gives you hope? What's encouraging?
One of the things that's not encouraging, but first, the fallout of the COVID deal is you realize some of these markets are still markets that change, and that there was a lot of demand, and now that sell-off is starting to occur. And so we are seeing now values, they haven't risen. And if anything, you start seeing those coming down. Because you wonder, am I living in a world that everything is fundamentally changed from COVID? And my answer is no, not necessarily. The fact that you can live anywhere and be anywhere, that all hasn't fundamentally changed the landscape in my view yet. So, I'm seeing that, and it just tells me that there are still markets, and there's still this market-driven world that we have to address and think about from even a planning standpoint. But I just find there's not a lot of hope because there's so many things going on right now that are putting neighbors against each other from somewhat of a political perspective. But the land is resilient. And so I tend to focus on the land and the landscapes. And hopefully we all realize that if we can keep this together, keep servicing these local areas. I love when I see the communities come together, raising cows and slaughtering and providing local food for local people. When I see things like that, I smile like, okay, that can still work. Not everything is internationalized here in these small communities. And I pinch myself as I live in the West. And I enjoy living here. And I do like it when people do come together. And I still see that day to day in these rural communities.
Yeah, and I do too. I think there's so much less divide actually than you might hear in the news. That's what gives me hope as well. And there's a lot of great collaboration, local groups coming together, landowners and other stakeholders sitting down at the table. And there's a lot of great planning happening out there. Just the awareness that the 5 or 35 acre, in particular, 35 acre parcel size really is maybe not the best when it comes to trying to both increase housing availability and strengthen communities and also take care of our wildlife and other values on the land, that maybe we need to rethink that. And just that constant growing awareness and the creative ideas that are coming out to address that, I also give me hope. So we'll see what comes in the next decade or so, but we are in this massive land transition right now. So the West is inevitably going to look quite different a decade or so from now than it does today, I'm sure. Ken, thank you so much for being part of the conversation, for all that you've done for land conservation and for the organizations you've been involved with, including the Western Landowners Alliance.
And thank you for what you guys are doing. It's a new way of messaging, and it goes outside the typical kind of the Cattlemen's Association. Not just focusing on lobbying and doing certain things just for a certain cause. You're getting a message, you're educated. And I think it's so cool.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks again to Ken Mirr for joining us today. You can learn more about Ken's work and find some articles he's written for On Land over the past few years at the link in the show notes or by heading over to onland.link/podcast. On Land is a production of Western Landowners Alliance, a West-wide organization of landowners, natural resource managers, and partners dedicated to keeping working lands whole and healthy for the benefit of people and wildlife. This episode was hosted by Leslie Allison, produced by me, Zach Altman, and edited by Kathleen Shannon. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend, or go leave a review wherever you get your podcast. Thanks for being here, and we will see you next time.